A human body, when pushed to the edge of agony, does not surrender quickly. The nerves scream long after the mind has given up. The heart can keep pumping, the lungs can keep heaving, and the brain can remain aware, fully, painfully aware, even as it is being torn apart from the inside. This grotesque endurance is not a mercy. It is a design flaw, one that medieval executioners learned to exploit with surgical precision. And no execution in British history embodies this cruel science better than the fate of Sir William Wallace, the man English scribes once called a traitor and Scots a patriot. Wallace's death has been sanitized by history, romanticized in film, and reduced to a footnote in stories of Scottish resistance. But the truth, the real, physical, unspeakably calculated destruction of William Wallace, remains almost too graphic for history textbooks. He was not simply executed. He was ritually dismembered, psychologically broken, and publicly humiliated in one of the most sophisticated displays of state-sponsored torture ever recorded in the medieval world. What happened to William Wallace on August 23, 1305 at Smithfield in London was not just the killing of a man, it was the symbolic obliteration of an entire movement. His death was a performance, a lesson carved into flesh, a message written in blood, and it was meticulously crafted to terrorize a people into submission, to make resistance seem not just fatal but unbearable. This was not about justice. It was about domination. It was about what a terrified empire does when faced with a man it cannot control. Wallace's execution was a process, not an event. It unfolded in stages, each more depraved than the last. Each step designed to strip him, not just of life, but of identity, dignity, and legacy. You may think you've heard this story before. You haven't, because what you've heard is a version shaped by centuries of censorship and strategic forgetting. To understand the true horror of Wallace's final hours, we must peel away the legends, the nationalism, the film scripts, and the folklore. We must go inside the psychological machine that turned his death into public theater. We must watch as a man is systematically unmade, not just by sword and rope, but by fear, spectacle, and the cold precision of political messaging. This is not the story of a martyr. It is the story of a deconstruction. This is the real execution of William Wallace. To many today, William Wallace is a name carved into the mythology of freedom, a defiant warrior whose last breath whispered liberty into the soul of a nation. But before he was legend, he was an inconvenient man, a political problem, and, more dangerously, a man who had slipped the leash. Wallace emerged during one of the most volatile chapters in British history, a time when Scotland was leaderless, fractured, and slowly being absorbed under the crushing weight of Edward I's ambition. The English king, known as Hammer of the Scots, didn't just want to conquer Scotland, he wanted it to surrender itself, to believe that submission was inevitable, even moral. But William Wallace refused to play along. He wasn't nobility. He wasn't polished. He didn't come from the elite military caste that usually defined rebellion in medieval Europe. He was a commoner, a landowner's son, untitled, untrained in courtly diplomacy, and therefore unpredictable. And that made him lethal. In 1297, Wallace led a guerrilla campaign that embarrassed England on a scale that bordered on absurd. At the Battle of Stirling Bridge, a vastly outnumbered force of Scots under Wallace's command annihilated a professional English army. The defeat humiliated Edward's generals, men trained in chivalric warfare who had been outwitted by a so-called outlaw. Worse, the victory gave Wallace something far more dangerous than battlefield success: mythic power. He was knighted. He was declared Guardian of Scotland. And for a brief moment, William Wallace, the unlikeliest of rebels, became the voice of a nation refusing to be broken. But victories fade, and for empires, memory is a weapon. When Edward I eventually returned to crush the rebellion himself, he didn't just want to kill Wallace, he wanted to make him disappear. Not physically, symbolically, culturally, historically. The problem was that Wallace refused to vanish. Even after his military defeats, even after the nobility of Scotland turned inward or surrendered, Wallace continued to resist. He became harder to find, harder to pin down. He survived as an idea that resistance was still possible. This was his true crime in the eyes of the English crown. Not rebellion, not the killing of soldiers, but the refusal to surrender the narrative. To an empire obsessed with order, Wallace was dangerous because he showed that fear could be resisted, that peasants could become symbols, and that power, once challenged, could bleed. So, when he was finally betrayed and captured in 1305, handed over by a fellow Scot, John de Menteith, the English didn't rush to kill him. They planned. They drafted a performance so precise, so deliberately sadistic, that it would echo for generations. Not as justice, but as deterrence. And Wallace, now shackled and blindfolded, became the centerpiece of a state-sponsored play where death was only the final act. His execution was not merely punishment for rebellion. It was an act of theater, designed to tell the world what happens to those who dare to imagine they can stand against a king. The man who had once carried a broadsword into battle would now carry chains. And he would walk not to a grave, but to a ritual dismantling of the self. When William Wallace was captured in August 1305, it wasn't by English knights in heroic combat. It was through betrayal, a quiet, backroom surrender by John de Menteith, a Scottish nobleman who had aligned himself with Edward I. There was no battle, no standoff. Wallace was simply taken. But what happened next reveals the full cruelty of the medieval justice system when weaponized by a state desperate to erase not just a person, but a symbol. Wallace was shackled, not just restrained, but visibly, emphatically dehumanized. He was paraded like livestock from Scotland to London, a slow, humiliating journey carefully staged for maximum exposure. Along the way, he was displayed, not hidden. English citizens were encouraged to mock, spit, and jeer at the prisoner. He was forced to ride while bound, often bareback, deliberately ensuring pain and exhaustion. Accounts suggest Wallace was starved and denied sleep, not out of logistical failure but strategic intent. This was not transportation. It was psychological erosion. By the time Wallace reached London, he was already breaking. Not in body, but in mind. The spectacle had begun long before the scaffold was ever built. The streets of London received him not with shock, but with celebration. To the English public, Wallace had been painted as a monster, a traitor, a barbarian, even a heretic. Propaganda had done its work. People lined the roads not to mourn a fallen soldier, but to witness a monster being brought to slaughter. But the trial that followed was not truly a legal proceeding. It was a ritual scripted from beginning to end. On August 23, 1305, Wallace stood before a special court convened at Westminster Hall, the seat of royal justice. But he was not allowed to speak freely, nor to call witnesses, nor to present evidence. He was accused of treason against Edward I, murder of English civilians and soldiers, sacrilege against the church, barbaric warfare unbecoming a knight. The last charge is particularly revealing. Wallace was being condemned not just for what he did, but for how he did it. His unconventional tactics, ambushes, night raids, attacking supply lines, had embarrassed and unsettled the English. He fought like a ghost. Now they would punish him like one. When the accusation of treason was read, Wallace responded, and what he said cut through centuries of propaganda. "I could not be a traitor, for I was never Edward's subject." That sentence, that single act of defiance, was an unpardonable sin. It was a denial of the king's authority, not just of his rule over Wallace, but of his very legitimacy in Scotland. And it made Wallace more than a criminal, it made him an existential threat. From that moment forward, his execution was no longer about justice. It was about annihilation. The court didn't deliberate. It didn't hesitate. Wallace was found guilty, a foregone conclusion, and sentenced not to death, but to a sequence of deaths. First, he would be hanged until nearly dead. Then, emasculated, his genitals severed and burned before his eyes. Then, eviscerated, his intestines pulled out while he still breathed. Then, his heart torn from his chest. Only then, after maximum agony, would he be beheaded and quartered. Each act had symbolic meaning: the hanging to disgrace, the castration to destroy virility and future, the evisceration, to extract the source of rebellion, the beheading to silence, the quartering to scatter both his flesh and his legacy. But these weren't medieval impulses. They were meticulously designed messages. The execution, like the trial, was never meant to be fair. It was meant to be memorable, because empires don't just kill rebels. They dismantle them piece by piece in front of the world. And for Wallace, that dismantling was just beginning. There are many ways to kill a man, but few are as cruel or as calculated as dragging him through the streets of a city that hates him, letting every step become a lesson in humiliation. William Wallace's final journey began not with a prayer, but with a rope. Stripped nearly naked, he was bound at the wrists and ankles, tied to the back of a horse, not on it but behind it, and dragged through the streets of London. This was not an accident of medieval brutality. It was policy. The sentence, to be drawn, meant precisely this: to be publicly hauled through mud, dung, filth, and human waste, exposed to jeers, rocks, and the cold indifference of a crowd conditioned to treat his agony as theater. The route was deliberate. From the Tower of London through the busiest districts, Wallace was paraded before the people like a living corpse. Every jolt of the road snapped his bones against the wooden slats. Every turn revealed new faces, some curious, some gleeful, many hostile. He was not yet dying, but he was being prepared for death. Like an animal fattened for slaughter, except in reverse, he was being weakened emotionally and physically, so that when the killing finally began, resistance would be impossible. The dragging took hours, not because of distance, but because the slower, the better. Each painful bump and scrape over cobblestones, each puddle of refuse, each jeering voice added to the psychological erosion. To the people of London, Wallace had become a cautionary tale in motion, a symbol of what happens when a man defies the crown, not just through violence, but through belief. Imagine the noise, the low rumble of thousands watching, shouting, some laughing, others indifferent. Imagine the smell, the stench of filth, blood, sweat, and unwashed bodies. Imagine the confusion, the sensory chaos of dying before you are dead. For Wallace, this wasn't a journey to an end. It was the beginning of a ritual erasure, because Edward I didn't want William Wallace simply dead. He wanted him destroyed, reduced piece by piece, from man to monster to nothing. Even the location of the execution was chosen with symbolism in mind. Smithfield, a place traditionally used for livestock markets and public executions. The message was clear. Wallace would not die as a knight or even as a man. He would die as meat, butchered in public for a hungry crowd, then carved up and distributed like refuse. And yet, Wallace remained, as accounts suggest, silent. He did not beg. He did not cry out. If he trembled, it was from pain, not fear. But silence is not the same as peace. It is often the final coping mechanism of a mind that has already begun to break. And so, by the time he arrived at Smithfield, covered in cuts, bruises, excrement, and humiliation, Wallace had already endured a psychological execution. The man was alive, but his autonomy, his dignity, and his public voice had been systematically stripped away. What followed would not be a single act of killing. It would be a series of anatomical messages, written in flesh, delivered by blade, and witnessed by a nation. This was not justice. This was theater. And the curtain was only just beginning to rise. The first cut wasn't a blade. It was a rope. At Smithfield, the crowd was already thick, pressed together in an open field under gray skies. They weren't there to watch justice. They were there to be entertained, to feel the power of the crown made visible, not in gold, not in law, but in the slow, deliberate destruction of a human being. William Wallace stood at the base of the scaffold, filthy, bleeding, and broken from his dragging through the streets. But death would not come swiftly, not yet, not even close. The first stage of his sentence was to be hanged, but not killed. In medieval England, hanging was not a science. There were no calculations of drop height to ensure a clean neck break. Instead, the condemned were often hoisted by hand, slowly strangled, their feet kicking just above the earth. But Wallace's hanging was never meant to be fatal. It was meant to simulate death, and to pause just before it arrived. He was bound, his neck looped through a coarse rope, then hoisted into the air. Not dropped, lifted so the hanging would be gradual. Witnesses described him convulsing, gasping, his legs twitching violently. His face turned dark, not from fear, but from oxygen starvation. His throat swelled, his tongue protruded, and just as unconsciousness threatened to steal him from the pain, he was cut down. He fell hard, likely unable to move, coughing, choking on his own saliva and blood, but still alive, still awake, because the next acts required consciousness. This partial hanging was not punishment. It was preparation. It disoriented the senses, confused the brain, blurred the line between death and life. To the crowd, it was the opening act. To Wallace, it was the first fragment of his soul breaking loose. Modern psychologists would call it induced trauma. Military interrogators might call it controlled asphyxiation. In medieval England, it was just a prelude, because the real pain hadn't even begun. Wallace now lay crumpled at the base of the scaffold, half dead, barely breathing and helpless. And that's exactly where they wanted him. He would be awake for what came next, because what came next required the victim to see it, feel it, and understand it. Not just for his sake, but for the crowd's. This wasn't about removing a threat. This was about sending a message. The body on the scaffold was no longer Wallace the man. It was Wallace the object, a canvas onto which the English crown would paint a lesson in pain. And as the hangman stepped back and pulled out a small, hooked knife, the performance shifted tone. No longer just spectacle, now surgery. Wallace lay gasping on the scaffold, his neck swollen from the rope, his lungs still dragging air back into a body that had begged to stop. But now came the part that no fiction has dared to truly show, because it would be almost unfilmable in its sheer, ritualized cruelty. The executioner didn't hesitate. There were no words, only a blade, and with that first slice, the horror truly began. The knife was not meant for mercy. It was small, serrated, and used not to kill, but to open. The executioner began by castrating Wallace, severing his genitals and holding them aloft for the crowd to see. They were then thrown into a fire in front of him, a symbolic annihilation of his masculinity, his legacy, his future. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens to the man who defies the crown. This is how the English destroy not just rebellion, but the ability to reproduce it. But Wallace was still alive. He saw it. He felt it. And now came the part meant to push him to the limits of human awareness. Next, the blade moved lower. With practiced hands, the executioner sliced Wallace's abdomen, slowly and deliberately, opening him up like a specimen. His intestines, feet upon feet of living tissue, were then drawn out of his body inch by inch. Each pull was a statement. Each exposed organ was a symbolic extraction of defiance. The crowd didn't see a man dying. They saw a body being turned inside out, piece by piece, as though stripping away his very essence. Wallace was conscious throughout. His body twitched, his chest heaved, and according to several chroniclers, his eyes, still lucid, still blinking, followed the movements of his own viscera being burned in front of him. Imagine that. To watch your own insides feed a fire meant for public spectacle. This was not execution. This was ritualized deconstruction. A soul being forced to watch itself leave the body. Modern physiology tells us that a man in that condition might remain conscious for several minutes, especially if adrenaline and trauma shock keep the brain temporarily functional. Which means Wallace didn't just feel the knife. He likely heard his own breathing go ragged, felt his pulse weakening, smelled the scent of his own burning flesh. The English chroniclers who approved of his death made sure to describe it not with shame, but with precision, because they wanted future readers to know that this was not simply justice, it was a political masterpiece. The execution wasn't just for the people gathered at Smithfield. It was for the historical record. It was documented cruelty, a textbook for power, a blueprint for control. And as the executioner reached into Wallace's chest, slicing through tissue to remove the still-beating heart, that performance reached its apex. The heart, the symbol of courage, rebellion, life, was ripped out and thrown onto the fire like the rest. A final gesture meant to say, "You are not just dead, you are undone." And still, the body wasn't finished, because the killing of William Wallace could never be complete with the death of just one body. What remained had to be scattered, fragmented, and erased across the kingdom. And that final act, the beheading, the quartering, and the symbolic dispersal, would ensure that no single place, no single grave, no single memory could hold him. By the time Wallace's heart had been torn from his chest, he was dead, or close enough that the line no longer mattered. What remained on the scaffold was not a man, but a symbol, one that the English crown intended to dismantle completely. Death, in this context, was never the goal. Control of the memory was. And so, Edward I's executioners moved into their final task. Not to bury Wallace, not even to discard him, but to fragment him piece by piece across geography, politics, and culture. They began with his head. It was removed with a clean cut, or at least as clean as medieval axes allowed. There was no reverence, no ceremony. The severed head was dipped in tar to preserve it, not for burial, but for display. It was mounted on a pike and placed above the southern gatehouse of London Bridge, facing outward, a grisly warning to every traveler entering the city. There, among the grime and smoke of the capital, Wallace's head became a message carved in bone and gristle. This is what defiance looks like. This is the price of rebellion. But that was only the beginning. His body was then quartered, a violent process in which the torso and limbs were hacked apart using axes and knives. Each quarter was then assigned a destination, not chosen at random, but for maximum psychological and political effect. One quarter was sent to Newcastle, a city bordering Scotland, a constant, looming reminder to any would-be Scottish rebels that the Empire watched every movement. Another was sent to Berwick-upon-Tweed, a contested town, often caught in the tug-of-war between England and Scotland. A third was sent to Stirling, where Wallace had claimed his greatest victory. The last to Perth, another site of resistance. These were not burial sites. They were billboards of horror. Each piece of Wallace's body was nailed up, mounted, or hung in the public square, where they rotted in the open air, not hidden from view, but deliberately positioned to be seen. And seen they were. Children saw them. Clergy passed them. Merchants walked beneath them. Every person who looked up at those dismembered parts of William Wallace was being re-educated, taught to understand the consequences of sedition not through words, but through viscera. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was imperial communication. It told every village, every hamlet, every soldier, you will not rise, you will not resist, because we do not merely kill, we dismantle. Wallace's body, now scattered across the land he once fought to free, became a macabre map, an anatomical warning stitched into the very soil of Britain. And yet, even in this final act of domination, the English crown failed in its most important objective. They did not destroy him, not truly, because even as his limbs were nailed to gates and his head blackened in the London sun, the idea of Wallace began to grow, not in the cities that killed him, but in the country he died for, in taverns and whispers, in smuggled songs and outlawed prayers. Wallace's story survived, and in time, his death became not a warning, but a prophecy. Because the more Edward I tried to silence him with spectacle, the louder Wallace became. His body was gone, but the rebellion, the memory, the defiance, had only just begun.